Captain Naomi Carter strode confidently through the bustling halls of Pacific International Airport, her every step radiating a quiet assurance owned over years of navigating the skies. Her reputation as a seasoned pilot and a trailblazer in the aviation industry preceded her, but it wasn't enough to shield her from the skepticism of others, like her co-pilot, Captain Eric Blake, who barely masked his condescension. What began as a routine flight would soon evolve into a clash that tested the limits of respect, leadership, and courage. At 36,000 feet, the lesson learned would be unforgettable for everyone involved. Before we dive into this gripping story, let us know where you're tuning in from in the comments below. If you love tales of resilience, empowerment, and justice, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to bring you inspiring stories like this one. Now, let's get started. The Horizon Air 737 trembled as it encountered a pocket of turbulence, the cabin shuddering with a force that made passengers grip their seats. In the cockpit, Captain Naomi Carter maintained her composure, her hands steady on the controls as she spoke into the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered some turbulence, but there's no cause for concern. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened, and we'll have a smoother ride shortly." She flipped off the mic and turned her attention to Captain Blake, seated beside her. His fingers hovered nervously over the instrument panel, his jaw tight. Naomi had encountered this look before, not from Blake specifically, but from others who underestimated her because of her gender or the color of her skin. She pushed those thoughts aside. Now wasn't the time. "Adjust the altitude by 2,000 feet, she instructed, her tone calm yet decisive. "That should stabilize us." Blake hesitated, his hand hovering. "Are you sure that's the best move? The forecast didn't indicate turbulence at this level." Naomi suppressed a sigh. "The instruments don't lie, Captain Blake. I've handled conditions like these before. Trust me, this is the safest approach." Instead of responding, Blake adjusted his headset and leaned back in his seat. His silence wasn't outright defiance, but it was dismissive enough to irritate Naomi. She had fought too hard for this position. 15 years of tireless dedication, relentless training, and overcoming prejudice in an industry that wasn't always welcoming. She wasn't about to let turbulence, or Blake's ego, derail her focus. Meanwhile, in the cabin, head flight attendant Lila Simmons adjusted her uniform and moved down the aisle with the grace that came from 3 decades of experience. Her warm smile reassured passengers gripping their armrests tightly, and she offered calming words to those who seemed especially on edge. But Lila felt it too, a tension in the air that went beyond the turbulence. Her sharp eyes landed on Captain Carter as she stepped briefly out of the cockpit to confer with Lila about the conditions. To Lila, Naomi wasn't just a pilot, she was a pioneer. Lila often compared her to Janet Collins, the first black woman pilot at Global Skies Airways decades earlier. Naomi wasn't just steering planes, she was breaking barriers. As Naomi returned to the cockpit, Lila's thoughts were interrupted by a voice from the aisle. "They let just anyone fly planes these days, don't they?" Lila turned to find an older passenger, Russell Green, leaning slightly into the aisle. His tone wasn't hostile but carried a skeptical edge. His weathered face bore the marks of time, and the military insignia on his cap hinted at a long career of service. "Captain Carter is one of the finest," Lila said firmly, meeting his gaze. "We're fortunate to have her at the helm." Russell nodded slowly. "I've heard about her, a fighter, that one. Reminds me of someone I knew back in '72. Can't recall her name, but she had the same fire in her eyes." Lila smiled. "She's got that fire, all right. We're in good hands." Back in the cockpit, the turbulence began to subside as Naomi's calculated adjustments took effect. The plane leveled out and a wave of calm swept through the cabin. Naomi allowed herself a small, fleeting smile of satisfaction, only for it to fade when she glanced at Blake. "Good call," he muttered, grudgingly. "Thanks," Naomi replied evenly. She didn't need his validation, but she'd accept the acknowledgement for what it was. As the aircraft cruised steadily at its new altitude, Naomi conducted a routine diagnostic check, her eyes scanning the readouts with practiced precision. Everything appeared normal, but her instincts urged her to stay alert. In aviation, skill and intuition were equally vital, and right now Naomi's instincts whispered a warning she couldn't ignore. Naomi glanced at Eric, who was focused on tapping into the flight management system, his expression unreadable. "Captain Blake," she began, keeping her tone calm yet firm, "we'll need to start planning our descent soon. Weather reports are showing crosswinds near the approach." Eric looked up briefly, his tone flat. "Understood, I'll handle it." There it was again, that faint undertone, as if he felt the need to assert his competence. Naomi chose not to engage. This wasn't the time for ego clashes. Their responsibility was to the passengers and crew. Nothing else mattered. As the minutes ticked by, Naomi couldn't shake a growing unease. She double-checked the instruments, ensuring every detail was accounted for. Everything appeared normal, yet the nagging feeling remained. In the cabin, head flight attendant Lila Simmons stepped into the cockpit, a rare hint of worry on her otherwise composed face. "Captain," she said softly, "a passenger reported hearing a strange noise near the rear of the plane." "I thought you should know." Naomi frowned, her mind instantly assessing possible issues. "What kind of noise?" "Like a faint whistling," Lila replied. "It might be nothing, but better safe than sorry." "Thank you, Lila. We'll check it out," Naomi said, nodding. She turned to Eric. "Run a systems check on the rear compartments. I'll monitor the cabin pressure levels." Eric hesitated, his hand hovering over the controls. After a brief pause, he complied, his movements mechanical. As they worked, Naomi's unease deepened. She didn't know it yet, but this flight would test her limits in ways she'd never imagined. The turbulence outside was gone, but the tension inside remained, an invisible weight pressing down on everyone aboard. In the cabin, Russell Green sat quietly, his mind wandering to memories of missions long past. Lila moved through the aisles with practiced ease, her sharp eyes scanning the passengers for signs of distress. Despite the calm exterior, the tension inside the plane simmered. The steady hum of the engines masked the unease brewing just beneath the surface. In the cockpit, Naomi sat upright, her gaze laser-focused on the instrument panel. Despite the plane's smooth cruising, the report of a strange noise from the rear compartments lingered in her mind like an unwelcome echo. "Anything unusual on your end, Eric?" she asked, keeping her voice even. Eric didn't look up as he worked the flight management system with mechanical precision. "Nothing so far. Probably just typical cabin noises. Passengers get jittery over nothing sometimes." His tone carried a mix of dismissal and impatience. "Let's not assume," Naomi said firmly. "Safety isn't something we gamble with." Eric gave a slight shrug, the tension in his shoulders betraying his irritation. Naomi ignored it. She had faced skeptics like him before. Pilots, technicians, and managers who underestimated her. This wasn't about her personally, it was systemic. But today, she had no patience for ego battles. Her focus remained on flying the plane and ensuring safety. Lila moved through the cabin with a calm demeanor, but her instincts whispered that something wasn't quite right. Her decades of experience had honed her ability to sense trouble before it fully surfaced. She stopped to check on an elderly woman gripping her armrest tightly, her knuckles white. Lila leaned down, her smile warm and reassuring. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" The woman hesitated, her voice trembling. "That noise? I don't remember hearing anything like it before." "Are we safe?" "You're perfectly safe," Lila assured her. "Captain Carter is one of the best, and she's keeping everything under control." The woman relaxed slightly, nodding in gratitude. Lila continued down the aisle until she reached Russell Green. The veteran had his arms crossed, his sharp eyes following her every move. "You're worried about something," he said in his gravelly voice, a statement more than a question. "What's going on?" Lila hesitated for a moment, then leaned in slightly, keeping her tone low. "A passenger reported a noise near the rear compartment. The captain's looking into it." Russell nodded thoughtfully, his expression calm yet focused. "Sounds like something's loose. Maybe worse. You need me back there," Russell said, his gravelly voice carrying a mix of concern and readiness. Lila chuckled softly, appreciating his offer. "Not yet, Mr. Green, but thank you for the vote of confidence." "Just saying," he replied with a slight shrug. "Loose ends get dangerous at 35,000 feet. In the cockpit, Naomi couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was off. The earlier turbulence had passed, but the report of the whistling noise stuck with her like a splinter in her thoughts. She tapped a few buttons, pulling up a diagnostic readout for the rear compartments. The readings appeared normal, yet her instincts screamed otherwise. "Eric," she said sharply, her tone cutting through the hum of the cockpit. "Double-check the diagnostics on the rear cargo hold. Something isn't adding up." Eric sighed audibly but complied, his fingers tapping at the controls. "Everything looks fine on my end," he said after a moment, though there was a trace of uncertainty in his voice. Naomi leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as they focused on a subtle fluctuation in the pressure gauge. It was faint, barely perceptible, but it was there. "Pressure levels seem stable, but I want to test something," she said, her voice firm. "Depressurize the rear cargo hold briefly, just enough to see if the sound changes." Eric turned to her, skeptical. "You really think that's necessary?" "Do it," Naomi replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Better safe than sorry." Eric hesitated briefly before nodding and adjusting the pressure controls. The faint whistling noise abruptly stopped, replaced by a low, ominous grinding sound that sent a chill racing down Naomi's spine. "Stop the adjustment," she ordered immediately. Eric obeyed, his face now mirroring her concern. "What the hell was that?" Naomi didn't answer right away, her mind racing to piece together the possibilities. Mechanical failure, a loose component, sabotage. Whatever it wasn't normal. In the rear of the plane, Lila moved deliberately, her steps quiet but purposeful. She paused near the cargo compartment door, pressing her ear against it. The grinding noise had faded, but a faint vibration remained. She placed her palm against the panel, feeling a subtle tremor beneath her fingertips. Turning to a nearby passenger, she offered one of her signature reassuring smiles. "Everything's fine, sir. We're just taking extra precautions." The man nodded hesitantly, but Lila's calm demeanor seemed to ease his anxiety. She tapped her headset. "Captain, the sound stopped after the adjustment, but there's still a slight vibration in the panel." "Understood," Naomi replied, her tone clipped but professional. "Return to your station. We're escalating this." As Lila made her way back toward the front of the cabin, Russell Green caught her eye again. "Miss Simmons," he said quietly, his tone measured. "Something's not right here. If you need help, don't hesitate." "Thank you, Mr. Green," Lila said warmly but focused. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." Back in the cockpit, Naomi leaned back slightly, her mind working overtime. The grinding noise was gone, but the mystery remained, and it gnawed at her. She glanced at Eric, who was now furiously typing into the flight management system. "Cross-check every maintenance log for this plane," she instructed, her voice low but firm. "Anything that seems out of place, flag it." Eric gave a curt nod, his earlier resistance replaced by a quiet determination. Naomi noted the change in his demeanor, even if it was overdue. Outside, the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting golden hues across the sky. The serene exterior belied the tension simmering within. Somewhere in the hidden recesses of the plane, a potential danger was waiting to be uncovered. Lila returned to her post near the galley, her sharp eyes scanning the cabin. Most passengers appeared calm, but she knew better than to trust appearances. Across the aisle, Russell gave her a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement of their shared vigilance. In the cockpit, Naomi's jaw tightened as she reviewed the data for what felt like the 100th time. "We're missing something," she muttered under her breath. The Horizon Air 737 cruised steadily through the skies, its engines humming a soothing rhythm. But Naomi knew better than to be lulled by the calm. The storm brewing wasn't in the air, it was in the unseen mechanics of the plane itself. Her instincts, unyielding as ever, refused to let the issue go. And Naomi Carter had learned long ago to trust those instincts, especially when the stakes were this high. "Could be worse." "You might need me back there," Russell Green said, his tone both serious and lightly teasing. Lila smiled, shaking her head slightly. "Not yet, Mr. Green, but I appreciate the offer." "Just saying," he replied with a faint grin. "Loose ends can be dangerous at 35,000 feet. Back in the cockpit, Naomi Carter couldn't shake the persistent unease that had settled over her. The turbulence from earlier was long gone, but the report of the whistling noise lingered in her mind like a splinter. She tapped a few buttons, pulling up a diagnostic readout of the rear compartments. The numbers on the screen seemed normal, but her instincts whispered otherwise. "Eric," she said, her voice sharper now, "run another diagnostic on the rear cargo hold. Something doesn't feel right." Eric sighed audibly, a faint edge of irritation in the sound, but he complied, his fingers tapping quickly at the controls. "Everything checks out fine," he said after a moment, though there was a slight waver in his voice that didn't go unnoticed. Naomi leaned closer to the panel, her gaze locking onto a subtle fluctuation in the pressure gauge. It was faint, barely perceptible, but it was there. "The pressure levels are stable," she began, her voice calm but firm. "But I want to test something. Depressurize the rear cargo hold briefly, just enough to see if there's any change." Eric turned to her, his expression skeptical. "You really think that's necessary?" "Do it," Naomi replied, her tone leaving no room for debate. "Better safe than sorry." Eric hesitated for only a moment before nodding and adjusting the controls. The faint whistling noise abruptly stopped, replaced by a deep, grinding sound that sent a chill down Naomi's spine. "Stop the adjustment," she ordered immediately. Eric obeyed, his face now mirroring her concern. What the hell was that? Naomi didn't answer right away. Her mind raced, cataloging possibilities. Mechanical failure, a loose component, or, worst of all, sabotage. Whatever it wasn't normal. At the rear of the plane, Lila moved carefully, her steps measured as she approached the compartment door. She pressed her ear to the metal, listening closely. The grinding noise had stopped, but a faint vibration remained, persistent and unsettling. Placing her palm flat against the panel, she could feel the subtle tremor. Turning to a nearby passenger, Lila offered her signature reassuring smile. "Everything's fine, sir. We're just being extra cautious." The passenger nodded hesitantly, visibly calmed by her steady presence. Tapping her headset, Lila spoke evenly. "Captain, the noise stopped after the adjustment, but I'm still feeling a vibration in the panel." "Understood," Naomi replied, her tone clipped but professional. "Return to your station. We'll escalate this." As Lila made her way back toward the galley, Russell Green caught her eye once more. "Miss Simmons," he said in a low voice, his sharp gaze meeting hers. "Something's off here. If you need me, you know where to find me." "Thank you, Mr. Green," Lila said warmly but firmly. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." Naomi leaned back slightly in her seat, her mind working overtime. The grinding noise might have stopped, but the mystery surrounding it hadn't been solved. "Cross-check every maintenance log for this aircraft," she instructed Eric, her voice level but urgent. "Flag anything even slightly unusual." Eric nodded curtly, his earlier skepticism replaced with quiet determination. Naomi noted the change and appreciated it, even if it was long overdue. Outside the aircraft, the setting sun bathed the horizon in hues of gold and orange, casting an air of serenity over the sky. But inside, the tension was palpable. Somewhere within the unseen systems of the plane, a potential threat lingered, waiting to be discovered. Back in the galley, Lila scanned the cabin with a practiced eye. Most passengers appeared calm, but she knew better than to trust surface appearances. Across the aisle, Russell gave her a subtle nod, a quiet signal of solidarity between them. In the cockpit, Naomi tightened her grip on the controls, her jaw set as she reviewed the latest data on the systems panel. "We're missing something," she murmured under her breath, her sharp instincts refusing to let the issue rest. The Horizon Air 737 cruised steadily through the evening sky, its engines humming a reassuring rhythm. But Naomi knew better than to be lulled by the calm. The storm brewing wasn't in the weather. It was within the intricate, unseen mechanics of the plane. Her instincts, honed over years of experience, screamed at her to dig deeper. Naomi Carter had learned long ago to trust those instincts, especially when lives were on the line. 3 full records? Isn't that overkill? "We're already running diagnostics and everything's fine," Eric muttered with a faint groan. Naomi turned toward him, her gaze unwavering. "We're responsible for 200 lives, Eric. There's no such thing as overkill." Eric hesitated, then shrugged reluctantly and began typing. Naomi could sense his lingering skepticism, but there was no time to address it. Her gut told her something critical was being overlooked, and she wasn't about to take any chances. In the cabin, Lila moved purposefully down the aisle, her practiced smile concealing the tension she felt. Decades of experience had taught her how to gauge a cabin's atmosphere, and today the unease was unmistakable. Her sharp eyes scanned the passengers for signs of distress. She stopped beside an elderly woman gripping her armrest tightly, her knuckles white. "Everything all right, ma'am?" Lila asked warmly, leaning down. The woman hesitated, her voice trembling. That noise earlier. It wasn't normal, was it? Are we safe? Lila's reassuring smile didn't falter. You're perfectly safe. Captain Carter is one of the best, and she's got everything under control. The woman exhaled slowly, her grip relaxing as she nodded, reassured by Lila's calm demeanor. As Lila continued her rounds, she noticed Russell Green watching her intently. The veteran's sharp eyes and composed posture stood out among the other passengers. You're worried? He said quietly when she approached. What's really going on? Lila hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying, her voice low. One of the passengers reported a strange noise near the rear. The captain is investigating, but so far, nothing critical. Russell nodded thoughtfully, his brow furrowing. Noise like that could mean something's loose. And loose isn't good at this altitude. Lila chuckled softly, appreciating his insight. Captain Carter's thorough. If there's a problem, she'll find it. In the cockpit, Naomi's unease continued to build. Eric, she called, her tone sharper now. Check the diagnostics on the rear cargo hold again. Something isn't adding up. Eric frowned but complied, his fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced precision. His irritation was evident, but he didn't argue. Diagnostics are still normal, he said after a moment. Everything checks out fine. Naomi shook her head, leaning closer to the instrument panel. Normal doesn't explain a grinding noise, she muttered under her breath. Her eyes locked onto a subtle fluctuation in the pressure gauge, a tiny but persistent anomaly. It was enough to confirm her growing suspicion. Depressurize the rear hold briefly, she ordered. I want to see if we can isolate the issue. Eric hesitated. You really think that's necessary? I don't think. I know, Naomi replied firmly. Just do it. Eric muttered something under his breath but complied. Moments later, the faint whistling noise returned. Only this time it was louder, a low grinding sound that reverberated through the cockpit. Naomi's chest tightened. Stop the adjustment, she commanded. Eric immediately complied, his face pale. That's not good. No, Naomi agreed, her mind racing. It's not. At the rear of the cabin, Lila reached the compartment door, her eyes narrowing as she examined it closely. She pressed her hand against the panel, feeling a faint but unnatural vibration beneath her fingertips. Tapping her headset, she reported, Captain, the noise stopped briefly after the adjustment, but there's still a vibration. Could be structural. Naomi's voice came through calm but decisive. Understood. Return to your station and keep the passengers reassured. As Lila made her way back toward the galley, Russell Green stopped her with a quiet word. Miss Simmons, he said, his voice low but steady. You've got that look. If you need another set of eyes or ears, just let me know. Lila gave him a small smile. Thank you, Mr. Green. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. Naomi reviewed the data on her screen, piecing together the clues. The grinding noise, the pressure fluctuation, and the persistent vibration in the rear compartment. Her instincts screamed sabotage, but she needed proof. Eric, cross-check the maintenance roster, she instructed. I want to know exactly who worked on this plane before takeoff. Eric blinked, his skepticism melting into concern. You think someone tampered with it? I don't think, Naomi replied grimly, but I'm not ruling it out. As the external cameras scanned the aircraft, something caught Naomi's eye, a faint shimmer on the screen. There, she said, pointing. Starboard wing, zoom in. Eric complied, adjusting the view until the screen revealed a loose access hatch, slightly ajar. Naomi's stomach clenched. An unsecured hatch at this altitude was a disaster waiting to happen. Contact ground control, she ordered, her tone sharp and focused. We're initiating an emergency descent. In the cabin, Lila returned to the galley, her voice calm as she addressed the passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, we're taking precautionary measures to ensure your safety. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Her announcement settled over the cabin like a thin veil of calm, though the tension lingered just beneath the surface. Kneeling beside the young boy who had first noticed the unusual noise, Lila gave him an encouraging smile. You've been such a great helper, she said warmly. Keep being brave, okay? The boy nodded, his fear replaced by a small but determined smile. I will, the boy said with a newfound sense of pride. As the Horizon Air 737 began its controlled descent, Captain Naomi Carter gripped the controls tightly, her focus unwavering. The shimmering image of the loose access hatch on the monitor confirmed her worst fears. This wasn't a routine mechanical issue. It was deliberate. "Eric," Naomi said quietly, her tone firm and steely, "pull up the flight history for this aircraft. I want every detail." Eric Blake nodded, his earlier hesitation replaced by a professionalism that Naomi had been waiting to see. "Got it." In the cabin, Lila Simmons maintained an air of calm authority as she reassured the passengers. Her steady presence was a source of comfort for many. Across the aisle, Russell Green watched her closely, his expression unreadable but his posture alert. "Your captain," he said softly as she passed. "She's sharp. She'll figure this out." Lila nodded, her confidence in Naomi unwavering. "I know she will." As the ground loomed closer, the weight of the unknown pressed on everyone aboard. Naomi's instincts had carried them this far, but she knew the real challenge lay ahead. This wasn't just turbulence. It was a brewing storm, and she was determined to see them through it. The Horizon Air 737 descended steadily, its engines humming in a controlled rhythm that belied the tension gripping everyone on board. In the cockpit, Naomi's hands moved deftly over the controls, every motion deliberate and precise. The image of the loose access hatch replayed in her mind like a flashing warning light she couldn't ignore. "Ground control has cleared our emergency landing," Eric announced, his tone carrying none of the doubt it had earlier. "Runway 3 is ready, and emergency crews are on standby." Naomi nodded, her focus unbroken. "Good. Let's coordinate descent speeds and approach vectors. I want this landing as smooth as possible. No surprises." Eric didn't argue. For the first time since the flight began, his tone carried respect rather than resistance. Naomi didn't dwell on the change. Her priority was getting the plane and everyone on board to safety. In the cabin, Lila moved methodically through the aisles, ensuring seatbelts were fastened and offering calm reassurances to nervous passengers. Most responded with nods, though their tight grips on armrests betrayed their nerves. She stopped at Russell's row. The veteran looked up at her, calm but with a knowing expression. "This is one of those stay calm, everything's fine moments, isn't it?" he asked. Lila smiled, appreciating his candor. "That's the goal. Captain Carter's got this under control." Russell leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing. "I believe you, but this isn't your average emergency, is it?" Lila hesitated, then nodded. "It's not routine, no, but she's the best at what she does." "Good," Russell said simply, "because sometimes the difference between life and death is having the right person in charge." Lila squeezed his arm briefly before continuing her rounds. Her next stop was the young boy who had first spotted the glint on the wing. He sat quietly, holding his mother's hand, but his wide eyes scanned the window as though searching for another clue. "You've been very brave," Lila said gently, crouching to his level. "We're almost there. Just keep sitting tight, all right?" The boy nodded, his small face lighting up with pride. "I helped, right?" "You absolutely did," Lila said warmly. "You helped the captain make a very important decision." Back in the cockpit, the tension was palpable. Naomi kept her eyes fixed on the instruments, her mind racing through the possibilities. A loose access hatch could have catastrophic consequences, but the grinding noise from earlier gnawed at her. It wasn't just a mechanical issue. Something about it felt intentional. "How's the approach looking?" she asked Eric, breaking the silence. "Vector's clean," Eric replied. "Winds are minimal and conditions are ideal." "Good," Naomi said, her tone focused. "Keep monitoring the starboard wing cameras. If that hatch shifts during descent, I need to know immediately." Eric nodded, his earlier doubt replaced by quiet determination. Naomi could feel the shift in him. He wasn't questioning her anymore. He was following her lead. As the descent continued, Naomi toggled the intercom to address the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Carter. We're beginning our approach for an unscheduled landing at Cascade Regional Airport. This is a precautionary measure to ensure your safety. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Thank you for your cooperation." In the cabin, Lila could feel the tension spike despite Naomi's calm tone. She walked back to the galley, taking a moment to steady herself before resuming her duties. Russell caught her eye again as she passed. "Your captain's got nerves of steel," he said quietly. "I've seen men break under less." "She's exceptional," Lila agreed, her voice filled with quiet pride. Russell leaned forward slightly. If you need an extra hand back here, don't hesitate. Lila gave him a grateful nod, her professionalism intact but her gratitude evident. The final moments of the descent were the most critical. Naomi Carter's hands gripped the yoke tightly, her eyes darting between the instruments and the rapidly approaching runway visible through the windshield. Beside her, Eric Blake kept steady watch on the starboard wing, his voice calm as he relayed updates. "The hatch is holding," he reported. "No signs of further movement." "Good," Naomi replied, her tone steady and controlled. "Gear down." The plane shuddered slightly as the landing gear deployed, a normal vibration that nonetheless sent a wave of unease rippling through the cabin. Naomi adjusted the flaps with precision, coordinating with ground control. "Approach vector clear," Eric confirmed. "We're aligned." Naomi exhaled slowly. "Brace for landing." In the cabin, Lila Simmons' composed voice came over the PA system. "Crew, take your seats. Passengers, please remain calm and seated. We're moments away from landing." Russell Green gripped the armrests tightly, though his face remained calm. A few rows back, the young boy who had spotted the glint on the wing clutched his mother's hand, his wide eyes fixed on the window. Lila gave him an encouraging nod as she strapped herself into the jump seat. The runway rushed toward them, the lights blending into streaks as the plane made its final approach. Naomi guided the aircraft with precision, every movement calculated and smooth. The wheels hit the ground with a jolt, the cabin filling with the sound of screeching rubber, and the engines reversing thrust. The Horizon Air 737 decelerated steadily, the tension in both the cockpit and the cabin breaking as the plane slowed to a crawl. "Ground control, this is Flight 183, Naomi said into her headset. "We've landed safely. Request immediate inspection and assistance." In the cabin, a collective wave of relief swept through the passengers. Some clapped softly, while others simply exhaled deeply, the strain of the ordeal etched into their faces. Lila unbuckled her harness and moved methodically through the rows, checking on the passengers. She stopped by Russell's seat, where he looked up at her with a faint grin. "Alive and kicking," he said in his gravelly voice. "Your captain deserves a medal." "She'll settle for a safe plane," Lila replied with a small smile before continuing down the aisle. She stopped at the young boy's row and crouched down to meet his gaze. "You were amazing," she said softly. "Thank you for being so brave." The boy beamed as his mother pulled him into a tight hug. Back in the cockpit, Naomi leaned back in her seat, exhaling deeply for the first time in hours. Eric glanced at her, a newfound respect evident in his expression. "You handled that like a pro," he said quietly. "Because I am one," Naomi replied, her tone light but firm. "Let's see what the ground crew finds." As the engines powered down and emergency crews approached, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The grinding noise and the loose hatch didn't add up. Somewhere in the mechanics of the plane, or perhaps in the intentions of those who had worked on it, lay the answers she needed. The storm, she knew, had only just begun. The runway lights faded into the distance as the Horizon Air 737 came to a complete stop. Inside the cockpit, Naomi exhaled deeply, adrenaline still coursing through her veins. The tension of the emergency landing was lifting, but the nagging questions about the loose access hatch and the grinding noise remained. "Ground crew is approaching," Eric said, his voice softer than usual. He glanced at Naomi with an unspoken acknowledgement of her leadership. That was impressive. Naomi didn't reply immediately. She kept her eyes fixed on the runway, her mind racing. "Let's wait for their assessment," she finally said. "Something about this doesn't feel right." Eric nodded, leaning back in his seat. For the first time since takeoff, there was no hint of skepticism in his demeanor, only respect. In the cabin, Lila moved through the rows, her presence calming as she checked on the passengers. Most had begun to relax, their faces showing a mixture of relief and exhaustion. She stopped at Russell's seat, where his sharp gaze met hers. "Well handled," he said, his tone carrying a note of admiration. "Your captain's got a steady hand and nerves of steel." "She does," Lila replied with a genuine smile. "We're lucky to have her." Russell leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "Reminds me of someone I knew back in 71, a chopper pilot named Elise Hart. She had that same fire in her eyes. Saved my life more than once." Lila tilted her head, intrigued. "A fellow soldier?" Russell nodded, his eyes distant. Yeah, we were in the thick of it during the Tet offensive. She flew into hot zones no one else dared to, pulling out wounded soldiers under fire. Always said it wasn't bravery, just duty. He paused, his voice softening. Lost her on one of those missions. Her bird got hit before she could make it out. She was the kind of pilot you don't forget. Lila absorbed his words, her respect for Naomi growing even more. Sounds like she left quite a legacy. She did, Russell said quietly, his gaze returning to the present. Lila Simmons' presence was a calming force amidst the tension. She moved through the terminal lounge, stopping at each row to offer smiles and reassurances that everything was under control. When she reached Russell Green, he gestured for her to sit beside him. "You don't look like someone who believes everything's under control," he said, his voice low but steady. Lila gave a wry smile. "I believe in Captain Carter. That's enough for me." Russell leaned forward, his weathered face contemplative. This kind of thing doesn't happen by accident. Someone wanted attention, and they were willing to risk lives to get it. "You've seen something like this before, haven't you?" Lila asked, sensing the weight behind his words. "Not on a plane," Russell replied gravely. "But in the field, during my time in Vietnam, sabotage was often used to test our response, to see how quickly we'd notice. It was rarely about the immediate damage. It was about sending a message, or preparing for something bigger." Lila's stomach tightened. "You think this is a test?" Russell shrugged, his expression unreadable. "If it is, they'll escalate." On the tarmac, Naomi and Mark Callahan, the airline's security chief, reviewed the personnel roster. Names of maintenance workers scrolled across the screen, each one flagged with clearance levels and shifts worked. "One name stands out," Mark said, tapping the screen. "Jacob Ellis. He was assigned to the starboard wing during the last check. But get this, he didn't clock out after his shift ended." Naomi's eyes narrowed. "Where is he now?" Mark shook his head. "We contacted his supervisor. Apparently he hasn't shown up for work today. His phone's off." "Convenient," Eric muttered. Naomi straightened, her resolve hardening. "Find him. If he's involved, we need answers." Mark nodded. "We're on it." As the investigation deepened, Naomi returned to the lounge. She found Lila speaking quietly with Russell near the edge of the room. "How's everyone holding up?" Naomi asked. Lila nodded toward the passengers. "Nervous, but stable. Russell here has been helping keep things grounded." Naomi offered Russell a small smile. "Thank you. It's not easy to keep calm in situations like this." Russell waved her off. "You've got bigger things to worry about, Captain. Just make sure this doesn't happen again." Naomi appreciated his bluntness. It mirrored her own determination. "That's the plan." Hours later, as dusk fell, Mark called Naomi to the operations center. "We've made progress," he said, gesturing toward a screen. "Our analysts traced Ellis's last known location to a motel just outside the city. Security footage shows him leaving late last night, carrying a toolbox." "Local authorities are on their way," Mark added. "We'll know more soon." Naomi nodded, her expression grim. If Ellis is involved, he didn't act alone. Sabotage on this scale requires coordination. Mark agreed. "We've flagged potential associates. If this is part of a larger plot, we'll need to act fast." Naomi's focus didn't waver. She prepared to brief her crew, her thoughts churning with unanswered questions. Why this flight? Why now? And most importantly, what's next? Her instincts told her one thing: the storm wasn't over. In fact, it was only beginning. The first glimmers of dawn painted the skyline as Naomi stepped into the airport's briefing room. The atmosphere was electric, a mix of urgency and anticipation. Outside, reporters had already begun to gather, their cameras trained on the terminal as whispers of Flight 183's ordeal spread. Mark entered moments later, carrying a stack of files. "We've got updates," he said, setting the files on the table. "Local authorities found Ellis at the motel. He's in custody, but he's not talking. Preliminary searches suggest he may have ties to a fringe group." Naomi's brow furrowed. "What kind of group?" Mark hesitated. "Anti-aviation extremists. Their manifesto involves disrupting commercial flights to undermine public confidence in air travel." Eric, seated nearby, let out a low whistle. "That's reckless and bold." "Reckless or not, it nearly worked," Naomi said, her voice steady but grim. "Do we have evidence tying Ellis to others?" "Not yet," Mark admitted. "We're digging through his phone records and online activity." Meanwhile, in the lounge, Lila worked tirelessly to keep the passengers informed and calm. The tension in the air was palpable, and whispers of sabotage had begun to circulate. Lila's years of experience taught her how quickly fear could spiral into panic, and she was determined to prevent it. She approached Russell, who sat quietly in a corner, his arms crossed. "How are you holding up, Mr. Green?" she asked. Russell gave her a wry smile. "Better than most, I'd say, but I can feel the storm brewing." "What do you mean?" Lila asked, lowering her voice. "When word gets out about sabotage," Russell said, his tone serious, "the media is going to have a field day. People won't just ask who's responsible, they'll start questioning if it's safe to fly at all." Lila nodded, sharing his concern. "Captain Carter's already under enough pressure. The last thing we need is for this to spiral out of control." Russell leaned forward, his expression steady. "Then you'd better hope she's as good with the media as she is with that plane." "A field day," Russell said. "People won't just be asking who's responsible, they'll be questioning whether it's safe to fly at all." Lila nodded, her concern mirroring his. "Captain Carter is already under a lot of pressure. The last thing we need is for this to spiral further." Russell leaned forward, his expression serious. "Then you better hope she's as good with the media as she is with that plane." Back in the briefing room, Naomi Carter braced herself for the inevitable press conference. Mark Callahan handed her a stack of prepared statements, but she set them aside without a second glance. "I'm not reading from a script," she said firmly. "The public deserves honesty, not rehearsed lines." Mark raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "Just remember, they'll try to twist your words. Stick to the facts." Naomi nodded, straightened her uniform, and stepped onto the makeshift podium. The room erupted in flashes of cameras and a storm of shouted questions. "Captain Carter, was this an act of terrorism? What steps is the airline taking to ensure passenger safety? Do you believe the crew was targeted?" Naomi raised her hand, and the room fell silent. Her voice was calm and steady as she began. "Ladies and gentlemen, my priority has always been the safety of my passengers and crew. Yesterday we faced an unprecedented situation that required decisive action. Thanks to the teamwork of my crew and the professionalism of ground personnel, we were able to land safely. The investigation is ongoing, and we are cooperating fully with authorities to uncover the truth." Her measured response drew murmurs of approval, but the questions didn't stop. A reporter from a major network stood. "Captain, how do you respond to allegations that the airline ignored safety protocols allowing this incident to occur?" Naomi's jaw tightened. "The safety of our passengers is paramount. Every protocol was followed. If someone exploited the system, we will ensure they are held accountable." The room buzzed with more questions, but Naomi held her ground, her composure unshaken. She left the podium to a mix of applause and the relentless flashes of cameras, knowing this was just the beginning. As the press conference concluded, Lila met Naomi near the terminal gates. "You handled that well," Layla said with a small smile. "But the media is going to keep digging." "They always do," Naomi replied. "What matters is that we stay ahead of the story." Russell approached, his expression a blend of respect and concern. "Captain, you've got the makings of a leader," he said. "But remember, the real battle isn't just with whoever tampered with that plane, it's with the public's trust." Naomi nodded, his words resonating deeply. "Then I'll make sure we win both battles." Later that evening, Naomi sat in her hotel room, the weight of the day pressing down on her. Reports from Mark indicated that Jacob Ellis was beginning to crack under interrogation, but the details were emerging slowly. Outside, the news cycle continued its relentless churn. Every anchor dissected the story of Flight 183. As she stared out at the city lights, Naomi's phone buzzed. It was a message from Mark. Ellis mentioned a second phase. "We need to talk. Urgent." Naomi's heart sank. The storm wasn't over, it was about to intensify. At the operations center, the tension was palpable as Naomi strode in. Mark was waiting, his expression grim, and he motioned for her to join him. Several analysts were hunched over their computers, their screens flickering with maps, logs, and intercepted messages. "What do we know?" Naomi asked, her voice steady but urgent. Mark handed her a tablet. Ellis finally cracked. He admitted to being part of a coordinated effort. "There's a second phase planned, and it's happening soon." Naomi's grip on the tablet tightened as she scanned the details. What's the target? Mark hesitated. That's what we're trying to piece together. Ellis only mentioned that it involves multiple flights and a coordinated disruption. Naomi's heart sank. The scale of the operation was larger than she had feared. Do we know how they're planning to pull this off? She asked. Mark gestured toward the lead analyst, now renamed Dana Wells, to bring Naomi up to speed. Dana stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. Based on Ellis's interrogation and the data we've uncovered, they're using insiders, maintenance crews, ground staff, even baggage handlers. They've planted devices designed to mimic routine malfunctions, delaying responses and causing widespread panic. Devices? Naomi asked sharply. Explosives? Dana shook her head. Not explosives. They're tampering with critical systems, hydraulics, avionics, and fuel lines. The goal isn't destruction, it's chaos. They want the public to lose faith in the aviation industry. Naomi exhaled slowly, her mind racing. How many flights are we talking about? At least 5, Dana replied. But the exact flights haven't been identified yet. In the terminal lounge, Lila Simmons kept a vigilant eye on the passengers, who were growing increasingly restless. Whispers of sabotage and coordinated attacks had begun to circulate, despite the crew's best efforts to contain the information. Leela moved between groups, offering calm reassurances wherever needed. She stopped by Russell Green, who was observing her with his usual piercing gaze. The tension's rising, he said quietly. You can only hold back the tide for so long. I know, Lila admitted, her voice steady. But until we have answers, we need to keep everyone calm. Russell leaned forward, his expression grave. Have you heard anything new? Lila hesitated, glancing around to ensure no one could overhear. There's talk of a larger plan, multiple flights, but that's all I know. Russell nodded grimly. If that's true, you better hope the captain is ready for what's coming. Back in the operations center, Naomi Carter studied the data displayed before her. What's the plan? She asked, turning to Mark Callahan. We've alerted the FAA and all major airlines, Mark replied. They're grounding non-essential flights and conducting immediate inspections on high-risk routes. Naomi frowned. Grounding flights will cause chaos on its own. People will panic. Mark nodded. It's a calculated risk. Better to face public frustration than the alternative. Agreed, Naomi said. What about Flight 183? Are we a target again? Mark hesitated. It's possible. Ellis mentioned your flight specifically during interrogation. It seems you were their test case. Naomi's stomach tightened. So this isn't just random. They're targeting us. As the sun began to set, Naomi joined Lila in the terminal lounge. Passengers continued to mill about, their patience wearing thin. They're getting restless, Lila said, her concern etched into her face. If we don't give them answers soon, we're going to have a situation. Naomi nodded, her mind running through the possibilities. Keep them informed, but don't let them know the scale of the threat. We can't afford a panic. Russell approached, his expression serious. Captain, he said bluntly, sounds like you've got a bigger problem on your hands. Naomi met his gaze, appreciating his straightforwardness. You're not wrong. Then you'd better act fast, Russell said. People can handle a lot, but uncertainty isn't one of them. Late that night, Naomi sat in the quiet operations center, staring at the map of active flights. Each blinking dot represented lives in the air, dependent on the integrity of the systems below. The weight of responsibility was suffocating, but Naomi refused to falter. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was a message from Mark. Intercepted a new communication. Details incoming. Naomi steeled herself. The storm wasn't just intensifying, it was here. The airport's interrogation room was sterile and dimly lit, with a single overhead light casting harsh shadows across the table. Jacob Ellis sat slumped in his chair, his hands cuffed, his face pale. Mark leaned against the wall, his expression stern as Naomi entered the room. Her uniform was crisp, her demeanor unreadable. Mr. Ellis, Naomi began, her tone calm but firm. We know there's more to this. You've already admitted to being part of the first phase. Now tell us about the second. Ellis shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting around the room. I've told you everything I know, he muttered. No, you haven't, Naomi said, stepping closer, her eyes locked onto his. Lives are at stake. If you cooperate, we can help you, but if you hold back, the consequences will be on you. Ellis hesitated, his breathing quickening. It's not that simple. They'll come after me, after my family. Naomi's voice softened slightly, though her resolve didn't waver. We can protect you, but only if you give us the information we need. Mark stepped forward, placing a folder on the table and flipping it open. Inside were photos of the tampered access hatch, intercepted messages, and a list of names. We already know you're working with a network, Mark said. We just need confirmation. Ellis stared at the photos, his hands trembling. Finally, he exhaled shakily. Okay, I'll tell you what I know, but you have to promise my family stays safe. Back in the terminal lounge, Lila continued her efforts to maintain calm among the passengers. Russell stood nearby, quietly observing the growing unease. Whispers of sabotage grew louder, and tension rippled through the room. This isn't sustainable, Russell said quietly as Lila passed by. You can't keep them in the dark forever. I know, Lila replied, but until we have solid answers, we can't risk causing a panic. Russell nodded, though his expression remained grim. Lila Simmons moved to calm a particularly agitated group of passengers in the terminal lounge. She glanced back at Russell Green, noticing his furrowed brow. His demeanor suggested he was calculating the risks, his military instincts undoubtedly kicking in. Despite the chaos, Lila couldn't help but feel reassured by his presence. Back in the interrogation room, Jacob Ellis finally began to talk. His voice trembled as he detailed the network's plans, how insiders were recruited, tampering carried out, and how the second phase involved coordinated malfunctions across multiple flights. They call it grounded wings, Ellis said, his hands shaking. The goal is to paralyze air travel for a day, maybe longer. Naomi frowned. And the flights? Do you have specifics? Ellis nodded hesitantly. They're targeting flights leaving major hubs, San Francisco, Chicago, Atlanta, but I don't know the exact times or numbers. They don't tell us everything. Mark Callahan exchanged a glance with Naomi. We'll need to cross-check this with the FAA and get ahead of it. Naomi nodded as she stood. Good, but this isn't over. If there's more, we'll find it. As they left the room, Naomi paused for a moment in the hallway, her thoughts racing. She clenched her fists, the weight of responsibility pressing heavily on her shoulders. The lives of thousands depended on the next move she and her team would make. Taking a deep breath, she steadied herself. There was no room for hesitation. Back in the lounge, Lila noticed a young mother struggling to keep her toddler calm amidst the rising tension. She knelt beside them, offering a kind smile and a few gentle words of reassurance. The mother's gratitude was evident, and it reminded Lila why she did this job, to provide comfort in moments of fear. From a distance, Russell watched the interaction, a faint smile curling his lips. Compassion goes a long way in times like these, he muttered to himself. Then, as if remembering something, he walked over to Lila. If there's one thing I've learned, he said quietly, it's that people need a leader they can trust. You and your captain are doing more than just holding this together. You're giving them hope. Lila nodded, her resolve strengthening. Hope might be all we have right now, but it'll have to be enough. Naomi returned to the operations center as her phone buzzed with another update from the analysts. New names linked to grounded wings, coordinating with federal agencies. The storm was no longer on the horizon. It was here, and Naomi was at the center of it. Steeling herself for the battles ahead, she glanced at the map of blinking flights on the screen and whispered under her breath, "Not on my watch." The hum of activity in the operations center reached a fever pitch. Analysts scrambled to update maps, mark high-risk flights, and coordinate with the FAA. Naomi stood at the center of it all, her commanding presence studying the chaos as she scanned the latest reports. Her mind processed every detail with razor-sharp focus. Mark approached her, his face drawn but determined. We've identified 3 flights with confirmed tampering. Crews are inspecting them now. But there's one we can't delay. It's already airborne. Naomi's heart clenched. Which one? Flight 729 out of San Francisco, Mark replied. It matches the profile Ellis gave us. If they've sabotaged it, the clock is ticking. Naomi turned to Dana Wells, the lead analyst. What's their altitude and route? They're cruising at 35,000 feet en route to New York, Dana said, her voice tense. We've sent an emergency message to the pilot, but communication is patchy. Naomi's jaw tightened. We need to act fast. Patch me through to air traffic control. In the lounge, Lila addressed the passengers over the PA system, her voice calm but firm. Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. Our team is working tirelessly to ensure your safety. Please remain seated and await further updates. As she stepped away from the microphone, Russell caught her eye. How do you do it? He asked quietly. Stay so calm under pressure? Lila offered a faint smile. It's not about staying calm. It's about making sure they see hope, even when I don't feel it myself. Russell nodded, his respect for her deepening. You're doing more than that. You're giving them something to believe in. Lila moved to speak with a group of nervous passengers, noticing a young child clutching a toy plane. The child's mother looked visibly distressed, her gaze darting between the departure board and her phone. Lila knelt beside them, her voice gentle. Are you doing okay? The mother hesitated before replying. My husband's on a flight. I'm scared something might happen. Placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder, Lila spoke softly. We're doing everything we can to make sure everyone is safe. Your husband is in good hands. We're doing everything we can to make sure everyone is safe, Lila reassured the worried mother. Your husband is in good hands. The child held up the toy plane. Is my dad flying one like this? He asked innocently. Lila smiled warmly. Yes, just like that. And we're going to make sure it lands safely, okay? Meanwhile, Naomi Carter was in direct communication with the pilot of Flight 729. The connection crackled with interference, but the captain's voice came through clearly. This is Captain Daniels of Flight 729. We're experiencing fluctuations in our hydraulic system. Control feels sluggish. Naomi's voice remained steady. Captain Daniels, maintain current altitude. We believe there may be tampering. Prepare for an emergency landing at the nearest airport. Understood, Daniels replied, his tone professional but tense. The minutes stretched into an eternity as the team in the operations center monitored the plane's descent. Dana Wells updated Naomi on the ground crew's readiness. They're standing by in Denver. If the tampering is severe, they'll need to act immediately once it's on the ground. Mark approached Naomi, lowering his voice. This is it, Captain. If this works, we can stop the rest before they escalate. Naomi nodded, her eyes never leaving the screen. We don't have room for failure. Flight 729 touched down in Denver with a jarring thud, its hydraulic system barely holding. Emergency crews swarmed the plane as passengers evacuated, shaken but unharmed. Naomi let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. Mark's phone buzzed and he glanced at the message. It's confirmed. The tampering matches the pattern. We grounded the other flights in time. A ripple of relief swept through the operations center, but Naomi's expression remained serious. This isn't over, she said firmly. We need to ensure this network is dismantled for good. Hours later, as the sun rose over the city, Naomi stood outside the terminal. The weight of the past 24 hours pressed heavily on her, but the first rays of sunlight brought a moment of quiet reflection. Lila approached, holding 2 cups of coffee. You did it, she said softly, handing Naomi a cup. Naomi shook her head. We did it. Everyone played their part. Russell Green approached, his steps slow but purposeful. Captain, he said, his voice steady, you've earned more than a few stripes today. You didn't just save lives, you restored faith. Naomi smiled faintly, her gaze shifting to the horizon where planes soared into the sky. As the sunlight warmed her face, she allowed herself to reflect. The image of Flight 729 safely touching down replayed in her mind, a reminder of what determination and teamwork could achieve. The crisis might have ended, but Naomi knew her work was far from over. This victory wasn't just about stopping a dangerous plot. It was about proving that unity, courage, and determination could overcome even the greatest challenges. Naomi Carter's story became a testament to leadership under pressure. It inspired countless others to believe in the power of collaboration and accountability. Her actions reminded the world that ensuring safety isn't just a job, it's a commitment to those who trust their lives to the skies. As she gazed at the planes soaring against the rising sun, Naomi whispered to herself, "This isn't the end. It's just the beginning of flying higher together." Naomi's journey is a powerful reminder that change begins with unwavering dedication and courageous decisions in critical moments. If you were in Naomi's position, how would you respond to a situation where the stakes were this high? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and share this story to inspire others and spread the message of hope, leadership, and resilience. Subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more powerful and uplifting stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.